December 1942. The stench hit them first, a mixture of human waste, rotting vegetation, and something else, something that smelled like death itself. Lieutenant Commander James Mitchell stumbled off the transport truck, his legs barely holding him after 3 days crammed in a metal box under the Philippine sun. Around him, 200 American prisoners of war blinked against the harsh light, taking in their new home. Camp O'Donnell. The name would become synonymous with suffering. But on that first day, as Japanese guards screamed orders and rifle butts found soft flesh, Mitchell and his fellow prisoners expected nothing but brutality and slow starvation. They were half right. What they didn't expect, what none of them could have imagined, was that their survival would depend on the courage of people they'd never met. People who would risk everything, including watching their own children die, just to slip a handful of rice through a bamboo fence. This is the story of an invisible army that fought without weapons, and the unbearable price they paid for compassion. Mitchell had been a Navy pilot, shot down over Bataan in April. He'd survived the death march, though barely. 65 miles of hell that had killed thousands. Now, standing in the mud of O'Donnell, he surveyed what would be his prison for the foreseeable future. Bamboo barracks with roofs that leaked. A single water pump for thousands of men. Latrines that were just open pits. The Japanese commandant, Captain Yashio Tsunayoshi, made his intentions clear during the first assembly. Through an interpreter, he informed them they were not prisoners of war. They were captives who had disgraced themselves by surrendering. They had no rights. They would work until they died or until Japan won the war, whichever came first. Most of the Americans figured it would be the former. The rations confirmed it. A cup of rice, sometimes a thin soup with a few vegetables floating in it. Maybe 200 calories a day for men who were already starving. Within weeks, men were dying at a rate of 50 per day. Dysentery, malaria, beriberi, simple starvation. The Japanese provided almost no medical supplies. The camp doctor, a captain named Robert Schwartz, performed amputations with a hacksaw and no anesthesia. He had 3 aspirin tablets for 800 sick men, but something strange started happening around the 3rd week. Mitchell noticed it first during a work detail outside the camp. They were digging ditches for a new Japanese installation, guards watching them with rifles ready. An old Filipino man passed by on the road, pushing a cart of vegetables. He didn't look at the prisoners, didn't acknowledge them at all. But as his cart hit a rut, a small bundle fell off the back. The guard didn't notice. The old man kept walking. When the guard turned away to light a cigarette, one of the prisoners, a sergeant named Danny Reeves, darted forward and grabbed the bundle. Inside were 6 eggs, wrapped in banana leaves. That night those eggs went to the sickest men in the barracks. It wasn't much, but it was something. And it was the first sign that they weren't completely alone. The incidents multiplied. A woman hanging laundry near the fence would drop a shirt, and when she picked it up, a small package of rice would be left behind. Children playing near the work details would kick a ball toward the prisoners, and inside the ball would be folded notes and sometimes medicine. Always the Filipinos risked everything. The Japanese had made their policy clear. Anyone caught helping prisoners would be executed, not just the individual but often their entire family. The method was always the same: beheading. Public, meant to terrify the local population into compliance. Mitchell met his unlikely savior in February 1943. The prisoners had been moved to a new camp, Cabanatuan, which was somehow even worse than O'Donnell. But it was closer to local villages, which meant more opportunities for contact. Mitchell was on a detail repairing a fence when he saw the boy. Maybe 10 years old, barefoot, wearing shorts and a shirt that was more holes than fabric. The kid was watching them work from about 30 yards away, partially hidden behind a tree. Their eyes met. The boy didn't run. Instead, he smiled. Then he turned and disappeared into the jungle. Mitchell thought that was the end of it. But the next day, the boy was back. This time he was closer, and he was carrying something, a small cloth bag. He waited until the guard was at the far end of the fence line, then darted forward. His small hand shot through a gap in the bamboo. Mitchell, working nearby, moved to intercept. Their hands touched for just a second. The bag transferred. The boy vanished. Inside were 6 small bananas and a piece of paper. The paper had a drawing on it, a crude map. An X marked a spot in the jungle, and a time, midnight. Mitchell knew it was insane. Leaving the barracks at night was forbidden. If caught, he'd be beaten, possibly killed. But something about that boy's smile, about the risk he'd taken, made Mitchell decide to try. That night, he waited until the guards changed shifts. There was always a 5-minute window where the patrol patterns overlapped and left a blind spot near the latrines. He'd timed it over weeks. He slipped out, moving through shadows, his heart hammering so hard he thought the guards must hear it. The jungle was only 50 yards away, but it felt like miles. Every snap of a twig under his feet sounded like a gunshot. He found the spot, a small clearing, and there was the boy sitting on a log waiting. The kid's name was Miguel. His English was broken, but better than Mitchell's Tagalog, which was non-existent. Through gestures and simple words, they communicated. Miguel's father had been killed by the Japanese in the early days of the occupation. His mother worked in the fields. His older sister had been taken by Japanese soldiers and never came back. Miguel had decided, in the way that children sometimes do, that he would fight back. His weapon was kindness. Over the next months, Miguel became Mitchell's lifeline. He came twice a week, always at midnight, always to the same spot. He brought food, small amounts, whatever he could steal or beg, a handful of rice, some fruit. Once, incredibly, a piece of dried fish, but more than food, he brought information. Miguel had a network, other children, old people, even some adults who were willing to risk everything. They gathered intelligence, troop movements, news from the outside world, rumors of American advances. Miguel would relay this to Mitchell, who would pass it to the camp leadership. It was how they learned about Guadalcanal, about the tide turning in the Pacific, about the fact that they might possibly survive this. And Miguel taught Mitchell Tagalog, simple phrases at first, hello, thank you, where is the guard, but gradually more complex ideas. The language became a code. If Miguel said a certain phrase, it meant danger. Another phrase meant good news coming. The bond between them grew. Mitchell found himself living for those midnight meetings, not just for the food or information, but for the connection. Miguel represented something Mitchell had almost forgotten existed: humanity, compassion, the idea that in the middle of hell someone could still choose to be good, but the cost of that goodness was mounting. In April 1943, a Filipino farmer was caught passing a note to a prisoner during a work detail. The Japanese response was immediate and brutal. They arrested the farmer, his wife, and their 3 children. The executions happened in the town square. The entire village was forced to watch. The youngest child was 5 years old. The message was clear. This is what happens when you help the enemy. For a while, the smuggling stopped. The Filipinos were too terrified. Mitchell understood. He didn't blame them. How could he? They were risking their children. But the absence of that connection, that lifeline, was devastating. The death rate in the camp spiked. Without the extra food and medicine, men who had been hanging on simply gave up. The camp doctor estimated they lost an extra 20 men that month because of the crackdown. Then, in June, Miguel returned. Mitchell almost wept when he saw the boy in the clearing. Miguel looked thinner, older somehow. His smile was gone. He handed Mitchell a small package. Inside was quinine, desperately needed for the malaria that was ravaging the camp, and a note. The note was in English, written by someone with education. It said, "We have not forgotten you. We will not abandon you. No matter the cost. We are Filipinos. This is our land, our fight, your fight. We stand together." The note was signed by dozens of names. Men, women, even children. A declaration of defiance. Mitchell asked Miguel if he understood the danger. The boy nodded. Then he said something in Tagalog that Mitchell had learned. Walang iwanan. Leave no one behind. The smuggling network expanded. It became more sophisticated. Women would bake rice cakes with medicine hidden inside. They'd bribe guards with alcohol to look the other way during certain times. Children would create diversions, staging fights or accidents that would draw attention while packages were passed. One woman, a schoolteacher named Rosa, organized a system where coded messages were sewn into the hems of clothing that was being washed for the Japanese officers. The prisoners would receive the clothing, extract the messages, and learn about Allied movements, Japanese vulnerabilities, anything that might help. Rosa was eventually caught. The Japanese tortured her for 3 days, trying to get her to reveal her network. She never spoke. They beheaded her in front of her students. She was 26 years old. Her last words, according to witnesses, were a prayer for the Americans she'd helped. The guilt Mitchell felt was crushing. He was alive because people like Rosa were dying. Children were orphaned because their parents had chosen to feed him. Families were destroyed because they'd shown compassion to strangers. He confided in Miguel one night, telling the boy through tears that maybe they should stop, that the cost was too high. Miguel's response was simple. He pulled out a small, battered photograph. It showed a man in a Filipino army uniform, Miguel's father. He died fighting the Japanese in the early days of the war. Miguel said in his broken English that his father had told him that some things were worth dying for. Freedom was one, honor was another, and helping those who couldn't help themselves was the most important of all. How could Mitchell argue with that? How could he tell this 10-year-old boy that his father was wrong? By 1944, the camp had been in operation for 2 years. Of the original prisoners, more than half were dead. But those who survived in part because of the Filipino network. The Japanese knew something was happening. They increased patrols. They executed more civilians on suspicion alone. In one village, they killed every male over the age of 15 just to send a message. But the network adapted. They became ghosts. Messages were passed through children too young to be suspected. Food was hidden in places the guards would never think to look. Once, medicine was smuggled inside the body of a dead dog that was being removed from near the camp. The prisoner's doctor extracted it and saved a dozen lives. Mitchell's role evolved. He became a coordinator, memorizing messages and passing them to the right people. He learned to read the subtle signs Miguel would give. A certain way of standing meant danger. A particular phrase meant good news. They developed a language that went beyond words. In September 1944, Miguel brought the most important message yet. The Americans were coming. MacArthur had returned to the Philippines. The liberation was beginning. It would take time, maybe months, but it was happening. The news spread through the camp like wildfire. Men who had given up found new reasons to live. The death rate dropped. Hope, it turned out, was the best medicine. But the Japanese knew it too. As the American forces advanced, the guards became more brutal. They knew their time was running out. Some talked about executing all the prisoners before the Americans arrived. The Filipinos heard these rumors, and they made a decision. In January 1945, the network organized something unprecedented: a mass delivery of food and medicine, timed to coincide with a shift change when the guards would be distracted. Dozens of Filipinos participated, including Miguel. They came from all directions, passing packages through the fence, tossing them over walls, even using slingshots to launch small bundles into the camp. It lasted maybe 5 minutes, but in that time they delivered enough supplies to feed the entire camp for a week. The Japanese response was savage. They arrested over 100 Filipinos. They couldn't prove who had participated, so they just grabbed people at random from nearby villages. The executions took 2 days. Men, women, children. The Japanese didn't discriminate. They lined them up in groups of 10 and beheaded them. The bodies were left in the sun as a warning. Miguel's mother was among them. She'd been caught with a bag of rice that she'd planned to pass to the prisoners. Miguel watched her die. He was in the crowd, forced to witness. Mitchell didn't learn about it until later, after the liberation. But he learned that Miguel had returned to the fence the very next night. He had one more delivery to make. A note. It said, "My mother said to tell you she was proud. She said what we do matters. She said you must survive. You must tell the world what happened here. You must make sure we are not forgotten. Promise me." The note was signed with a child's handwriting. Miguel. The liberation came in February 1945. The 6th Ranger Battalion, along with Filipino guerrillas, raided Cabanatuan in one of the most daring rescues of the war. Over 500 prisoners were freed. Mitchell was among them. He weighed 93 pounds. He could barely walk, but he was alive. As they were being evacuated, Mitchell asked about the Filipino civilians. He wanted to find Miguel, to thank him, to fulfill his promise. What he learned broke him. The Japanese, in their final days before retreating, had gone on a rampage. They'd systematically executed anyone suspected of helping the prisoners. Entire villages were burned. Families were wiped out. The death toll was in the thousands. Miguel's village was gone, every building destroyed, most of the inhabitants killed. Mitchell searched for weeks, even as he was being treated for malaria and dysentery. He asked everyone he met. Finally, he found an old woman who had survived. She knew Miguel. The boy had been killed 3 days before the liberation. He'd been caught trying to pass information about Japanese positions to the guerrillas. The Japanese had made him dig his own grave. He was 10 years old. Mitchell returned to the United States in April 1945. He was hailed as a hero. He received medals. He was interviewed by newspapers. Everyone wanted to hear about his survival, but Mitchell couldn't talk about it. Not really. How could he explain that he was alive because a 10-year-old boy and his mother had chosen to die? How could he describe the guilt that woke him up every night, the faces of the Filipinos who had been executed because they'd shown him kindness? He tried once, during an interview. He broke down halfway through and couldn't continue. The interviewer was uncomfortable. Americans wanted heroes, not complicated stories about guilt and sacrifice. So Mitchell stopped trying to tell it. He went back to his life. He got married, had children, became a successful businessman. But he never forgot. Every year on the anniversary of the liberation, he would write a letter, sometimes to the government, asking them to recognize the Filipino civilians who had died, sometimes to newspapers, trying to tell their stories. Mostly, he was ignored. The narrative of the war was about American heroism. There wasn't much room for the stories of civilians who had died in the shadows. In 1965, 20 years after the war ended, Mitchell finally returned to the Philippines. He was 52 years old. He went back to where Cabanatuan had been. The camp was gone, replaced by farmland. He went to Miguel's village. It had been rebuilt, but it was different, smaller, quieter. He met with survivors. He heard their stories. And he learned the full scope of what had happened. The estimates varied, but most agreed that over 5,000 Filipino civilians had been executed for helping American prisoners. Some were caught in the act. Others were killed on suspicion. Some were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Entire families were wiped out. Children were orphaned. The trauma rippled through generations, and most Americans had no idea it had happened. Mitchell made it his mission to change that. He spent the next 30 years documenting the stories. He interviewed survivors. He tracked down the families of those who had died. He compiled lists of names, dates, places. He wrote a book, though it took him 10 years to find a publisher willing to print it. When it finally came out in 1978, it sold modestly. But it started a conversation. Other veterans came forward with their own stories of Filipino compassion. Researchers began investigating. The Philippine government started recognizing the civilians who had died. In 1985, the U.S. government finally acknowledged the sacrifice. A small monument was erected at the site of Cabanatuan. It listed some of the names of the Filipinos who had died helping American prisoners. Miguel's name was on it, so was his mother's. Mitchell attended the dedication. He was 72 years old, frail but determined. He gave a speech. He talked about a 10-year-old boy who had taught him Tagalog and brought him hope. He talked about a mother who had died with pride. He talked about the thousands of Filipinos who had chosen compassion over safety. And he talked about the debt that could never be repaid. How do you thank someone who gave everything so you could live? How do you honor a sacrifice that cost so much? Mitchell died in 1992. In his will, he left instructions for his ashes to be scattered in the Philippines, near where Miguel's village had been. His family honored that wish. At the ceremony, dozens of Filipinos attended. Some were survivors of the war. Others were descendants of those who had died. They told stories about the smuggling networks, about the midnight meetings, about the courage it took to pass a handful of rice through a fence when the penalty was death. One old man who had been a child during the war remembered Miguel. He said the boy had been fearless, that he'd believed, truly believed, that what he was doing mattered, that saving one life was worth any risk. The old man said Miguel used to quote his father, who had told him that the measure of a person wasn't in how they treated their friends, but in how they treated strangers who could offer nothing in return. By that measure, Miguel and the thousands like him were giants. The story of the Filipino civilians who helped American POWs is not widely known. It doesn't fit neatly into the narrative of the war. It's complicated. It's painful. It asks uncomfortable questions about the cost of compassion and the debt of survival. But it's a story that needs to be told. Because in the darkest moments of human history, there are always those who choose light, who risk everything for nothing more than the belief that it's the right thing to do. Miguel was one of them. So was his mother. So were the thousands of Filipinos who smuggled food, medicine, and hope through bamboo fences. They didn't do it for recognition. They didn't do it for reward. They did it because, as Miguel once told Mitchell in his broken English, some things are more important than being safe. Some things are worth dying for. Today, there are memorials in the Philippines that honor these civilians. Small plaques in villages, monuments at the sites of former camps, but they're not well known, even in the Philippines. The generation that lived through it is almost gone. The stories are fading. That's why Mitchell spent his final years documenting everything he could. He wanted to make sure that Miguel and the others were not forgotten, that their sacrifice was remembered, that the world knew what they had done. In his final interview, given just months before he died, Mitchell was asked if he had any regrets. He thought for a long time before answering. Then he said yes. He regretted that he had lived while they had died. He regretted that it took him so long to tell their stories. He regretted that most Americans would never know the names of the people who had saved American lives at the cost of their own. But most of all, he regretted that he never got to thank Miguel properly, never got to tell that 10-year-old boy that his courage had mattered, that it had saved not just Mitchell's life, but his soul. That in the midst of unimaginable cruelty, Miguel had reminded him that humanity was worth fighting for. The interviewer asked if Mitchell believed Miguel would have understood. Mitchell smiled, the first genuine smile of the interview. He said yes, Miguel would have understood, because that's the kind of person he was, the kind who did the right thing not for recognition, but because it was right, the kind who taught a Navy pilot Tagalog phrases and brought him hope in the darkest of times. The kind who, even at 10 years old, understood that some things are worth dying for, and that some people are worth saving even if they're strangers, even if the cost is everything. The legacy of the Filipino civilians who helped American POWs is complex. It's a story of extraordinary courage and devastating loss. It's a reminder that war's victims are not always soldiers, that the cost of conflict is often borne by those who have no say in its conduct. But it's also a story of hope, of the human capacity for compassion even in the face of terror, of the bonds that can form between strangers when everything else is stripped away. Mitchell's story, and Miguel's, is just one of thousands. Each prisoner who survived had their own Filipino angel. Each act of kindness came with a risk that most of us can't imagine. And each life saved came at a cost that can never be fully calculated. The survivors, those American POWs who made it home, carried that weight for the rest of their lives. Many, like Mitchell, spent decades trying to honor the memory of those who had saved them. Some succeeded in getting recognition. Others died before their stories could be told. But all of them understood a fundamental truth. They were alive not because of their own strength or courage, but because of the compassion of people who owed them nothing, people who chose to risk everything for strangers, people who believed that humanity was worth preserving, even when the world seemed determined to destroy it. That's the real story of the American POWs in the Philippines. Not just their survival, but the price others paid to make that survival possible. It's a debt that can never be repaid, a sacrifice that can never be adequately honored, but it can be remembered. And in remembering, perhaps we can learn something about the true cost of war and the true meaning of courage. Not the courage to fight, but the courage to show compassion when compassion could cost you everything.